Well, hello there, everybody. And today we're going to be talking about Chapter 11, which focuses a lot on the peripheral nervous system, mainly the autonomic nervous system, which is comprised of two parts, the sympathetic and parasympathetic. And I know that you might think that sympathetic is you're on full on running from a grizzly bear mode, where parasympathetic, you're kind of laying back, relaxed like this, just having a good old time. And the reality is that those are opposite ends of the extreme. Usually we are in a situation where one side is slightly dominating over the other. And we'll go ahead and clarify that as well as the physiology behind it. And we're also going to talk about the somatic system, as in moving our skeletal muscle system. The somatic system is the conscious part of our movement. One thing to keep in mind with that is that scientists still are not entirely sure why we have free will, as in why are we able to think about something and do it. Sure, there's a lot of theories and a lot of hypotheses and some pretty decent evidence, but we're still not entirely sure why you can think and then do. It is an aspect of our cognition that we have not yet elucidated. So anyways, let's go ahead and let's start to take some notes on this. We're going to start with the flow chart. And this flow chart is going to show the aspects of the peripheral nervous system. Peripheral nervous system. Now, we haven't talked much about the central nervous system because it's a lot of brain anatomy. And also, the reason why I did that modified lecture was because we really don't know a lot about how the brain works. It is something that has largely, well, we'll just go ahead and say that it's a growing field of, oh my gosh, that happened here. It's a growing field of study. All right, I'm just going to move this to the side, kind of. Oh, if I can figure out how this works. All right, I think this is better. So peripheral nervous system. All right, let's go ahead and let's branch it off into the two categories. And one category is going to be the somatic system. And as I said, the somatic system is the conscious aspect of our movement. So it is muscle movement. As far as ligands go, the ligands are going to be, and just a reminder, ligands are a signaling molecule. It's going to be our friend ACH, acetylcholine. And as far as the receptor goes, we are going to have nicotinic. Our goal is we want to open sodium channels on skeletal muscle so we can depolarize the skeletal muscle and cause a contraction to occur. We'll be going through that next week. Now on the other side, we have the autonomic. It's called auto because it handles itself. We do not really have any control over this. I know there are some people like Wim Hof who actually has developed an ability to partially control his autonomic system. Very interesting fellow. And this is broken down into two categories here. One is called the sympathetic, and the other is called the parasympathetic. Something to note with the parasympathetic system is oftentimes it's the absence of sympathetic activity. But we're going to go ahead and give it a receptor ligand complex just to keep everything straightforward. And as far as the ligands go, we have epinephrine and norepinephrine. These are the stress hormones that are responsible for sympathetic activity. And the receptor, excuse me, the receptor is going to be adrenergic. And we know that there are kind of 5 categories or 5 subtypes of adrenergic receptors. We'll talk about those in a bit. And for parasympathetic, the ligand is going to be, once again, our friend ACH. And the receptor is going to be muscarinic. Pardon, muscarinic. All right. So let's go ahead and talk about the sympathetic and parasympathetic. So the sympathetic system, and I'll go ahead and clear this. If you need to go back and pause it, that's great. So the parasympathetic is what we call learned a big lesson about chewing gum while laying down. It's not a good idea. Highly do not recommend. It's also called the rest and digest system. And that's not very scientific, is it? So let's go ahead and kind of verify some things about it. Is blood and energy are dedicated toward digestion, excretion, and integument function. So what this is saying is that the body is really not in any immediate threat. And things like cardiac function, things like blood to skeletal muscles, things like opening up the respiratory airways, they're not necessary. We don't need a lot of energy to be coursing through our skeletal muscles when they really are not doing much. This allows the body to dedicate the majority of its resources to maintaining body functions. Next is the sympathetic. And this is called the fight or flight. And oftentimes we purposely activate the system. Next time you have a legendary workout, you're going to find that after a short period of time, you're going to start to, your muscles are going to feel warm. That's excess blood or the extra blood in your body going to your skeletal muscles. Your cardiac function is going to increase. Your respiratory rate is going to increase, as well as the amount of air you can breathe in. So that's how we can purposely activate it. But this is called the fight or flight system. And what's happening here is that blood plus energy are redirected from maintenance systems, as I call it, systems to heart, muscles, and, well, lung bronchodilation really doesn't take a lot of energy. In fact, if anything, it saves it. So I'll go ahead and just throw that in here. So once your sympathetic system is activated, think of the last time you were exercising hard, or think about when you were really stressed out. You probably lost your appetite. You probably lost the urge to excrete waste. Instead, you were probably really on edge. You were probably more focused on what was stressing you out or challenging you. And that's why when somebody's stressed out, some people lose their appetite, other people gain it. But when you feel like that you are in danger, thinking about what kind of toppings you want on your Pizza Hut. Is Pizza Hut still around? I think so, right? Well, anyways, thinking about what toppings you want on your pizza probably is not the best idea. Speaking of parasympathetic activity, back in the day, before everyone realized that fast food was just absolutely horrifyingly bad for you, there was the Pizza Hut buffet. And being a young male teenager, with an unlimited appetite, plus being a football lineman and really having every excuse in the world to eat terrible. My friends and I used to go to the Pizza Hut buffet, the one off Canaan Road in Agora, and I can tell you, we were probably one of the reasons why they stopped offering the Pizza Hut buffet. Not to mention legendary In-N-Out runs where we would get 10 by 10 In-N-Outs. Probably the reason why now they capped it at 4, because it's horrifically bad for you to eat 10 hamburger patties and 10 slices of cheese, then wash it down with a strawberry shake. All right, anyways, moving right along. So these systems are what we call antagonistic, meaning that they oppose each other. But at the same time, as I said, they have levels of dominance. Right now, you're taking notes, so the parasympathetic system is probably a little bit more dominant than, I know this is a crummy seesaw, than your sympathetic system. However, let's say that you realize that it's Friday morning and you haven't done any of your assignments. Now instead it's switched a bit. The sympathetic system probably going to be quite a bit more dominant than your parasympathetic system. So of course these are varying degrees of. They just can't be equal. One is always going to be more dominant than the other. All right, so that is it for the introduction. When we come back, we are going to explore the various effects of each system on body functions. See you in a bit. All right, everyone, well, welcome back. I decided that instead of trying to subject you to drawing or attempting to draw a table on the whiteboard function of Zoom, I decided it probably would just be best just to actually write or type on the document. So yeah, I was saying, how well can I free draw a table on the virtual whiteboard? And I decided not well. So here we are. All right, so here we have a document. What this is going to do is we are going to analyze exactly what effects the sympathetic and parasympathetic system have on different bodily systems. Let's go ahead and check it out here, see if I can make this full screen. Yes, I can. So first we're going to talk about heart rates. Sympathetic innervation is going to increase stroke volume, which is the amount of blood pumped out during each contraction. And it's also going to increase heart rate, meaning approximately how many times the heart contracts in a minute. We call these two terms together, we call them cardiac outputs. Not important that you know this now. We'll actually do, it's just simpler to note that the sympathetic system increases cardiac outputs. Meanwhile, the parasympathetic system actually decreases these, decreases stroke volume. Actually, we'll just go cardiac output. It decreases cardiac output. When the heart contracts, it's going to contract less forcefully, and it's not going to contract as many times per minute. That's because the body doesn't have to worry about pumping out blood faster in order to meet the energy needs of the system. Oh, and apparently I didn't realize I wrote stroke volume on the bottom. I guess I cannot read anymore. All right, yes, so as we put down here, we are going to increase stroke volume and then decrease stroke volume here. As I said, stroke volume multiplied by heart rate is going to give you cardiac outputs. So the net effect is it's going to decrease cardiac outputs. So we'll put down heart rate here. All right, for the pupils, we're actually going to relax some of these muscles. We are going to have dilation. The idea is that you want to maximize how much light gets into your pupils. Some of you may have had a test done at the eye doctor where your pupils have been purposely dilated, and you probably have been overwhelmed by the intensity of light. Well, the idea is that if you're in a survival situation, especially at night, you want to maximize how much light gets into your eyes so you can see more clearly. And for parasympathetic, I'm going to write constrict. That's really not entirely accurate. It's more like return to the baseline. All right, so the liver. One of the main properties of the liver is to store a molecule called glycogen, one of its many, many, many functions. So with the sympathetic system, you're going to have increased glycogen to glucose conversion. The idea behind this is that glucose is the readily available form of energy used by our body cells. So it wants more glucose to be in our blood. Parasympathetic is going to be the opposite. You're going to have more glucose to glycogen conversion to store the excess glucose in your blood as the storage molecule glycogen in case it needs it in the future. As far as lungs, with sympathetic, you're going to have increased respiratory rate. You're also going to have what's called bronchodilation. So your bronchioles are going to open up. With parasympathetic, you're going to have decreased respiratory rates, as well as, and again, I don't want you to think that it is purposely constricting. It's more like it's going back to baseline. You're going to have, compared to the sympathetic system, you're going to have bronchoconstriction. But it's more like back to baseline. So I'm just going to put down baseline. Gastrointestinal system. With sympathetic, you're going to have decreased blood flow. And you're going to have what's called vasoconstriction to the arterioles supplying energy. So what's going to happen is that, we'll talk about the system a bit later, is that the arterioles feeding blood into the gastrointestinal system are actually constricted, and that blood, of course, is being rerouted to more essential systems. Parasympathetic, you're going to have increased. Actually, let's go ahead and apologies if you already started to write it, but let's go ahead and put this down here. And here's going to be the opposite, is you are going to have increased blood flow, vasodilation. Should have read this a little bit more carefully before going in it, but trying to call audibles and get this back on track. So the gastrointestinal system, you're going to have increased motility, meaning that it's going to move along food at a faster rate. And for parasympathetic, you're going to have decreased motility. So food is not going to be moving nearly as quickly as it would in the parasympathetic. Sorry, I'm a disaster right now. You're going to have decreased motility for the sympathetic and increased motility for the parasympathetic. Because parasympathetic, rest and digest. What was I thinking? A sympathetic, you're going to have decreased motility. Food's not going to be moved as well. Parasympathetic, increased motility. Food will be moved at a faster pace. The pancreas, you're going to have decreased secretion of digestive enzymes. And this is because digesting food during a sympathetic response is not essential. The pancreas releasing enzymes would be futile. Meanwhile, the parasympathetic system, you're going to have increased secretion of digestive enzymes, because now it's time to process the food and quickly get it broken down into its basic parts so we can begin to absorb it into our bloodstream. As far as kidneys go, we are going to have increased blood supply Recall that the kidney's jobs are to filter the blood and clean it. And oh my gosh, bad day, folks, bad day. Decrease blood supply, because the idea is that you are redirecting that blood to more essential systems. And for the parasympathetic response, you're going to have increased blood supply. And the purpose behind that is because now you want to redirect lots of that blood to the kidney so it can be filtered. Under normal circumstances, the kidneys contain about 25% of your blood. So it is a significant amount of blood that is being filtered through your kidneys at any one moment. As far as the sympathetic response goes for the integument, is you are going to have decreased blood flow during the sympathetic response. And the purpose behind that is rather logical. In the fight or flight response, it is assumed by your body that you are going to be physically damaged, as in you are going to encounter cuts, lacerations, things that will damage the body. So the idea behind reducing blood flow to the integument is that you are not going to have a massive blood loss if you get damaged during a fight. So that's why is that people who are scared, nervous, anxious, or in a battle situation, is they're often going to appear, I guess the term is white as a sheet, because they're actually going to lose blood from their integument, and it will be redirected to other parts of the body. And of course, during the parasympathetic, you're going to have increased blood supply, which is why you're going to have a more rosy appearance when you are happy and relaxed. There's an interesting phenomenon called blushing. And it's interesting is that it normally comes when somebody is embarrassed. And I think that at least one theory I read was that when somebody blushes, it takes the enemy by surprise. So it's like going, oh, this person is blushing. I don't know why. And that will give you time to book it and get out of there while the enemy is confused. It's also why when people are incredibly scared, how sometimes they urinate or defecate, it's the same exact thing. It's, oh my gosh, this animal went poo. And they're like, huh. And then you just get out of there as they're contemplating that. So sweat glands, you're going to have dilation of the sweat glands. They're going to open up. So it's assumed that humans evolved in very hot tropical climates. And we know that sweating is designed to cool off the body. And if you dilate the sweat glands, you're going to have increased sweating. So what's going to happen there is that by sweating more, you are going to cool off faster. So it's assumed that if you are in a sympathetic response, is you are going to be exerting loss of energy, raising your body temperature, since it's assumed that you're in a hot climate, because we evolved in a hot climate, as is assumed, then sweating would give you an advantage. And of course, when you are relaxed, you're going to have constriction and decreased sweating. The size of your pores is dictated by muscles, and if they are constricted, which is under normal circumstances, is you will not be sweating, but if they relax, then you will be sweating. The vagus nerve is interesting. It is designed to promote many parasympathetic responses. What's interesting has to do with heart rate. How did I spell this one? Sympathetic. Cool. One thing that's interesting about the vagus nerve, so the term vagus means wanderer in Latin. It's called the wandering nerve because it interacts with several bodily systems. What's interesting is that the vagus nerve is what promotes parasympathetic activity on the heart. And the idea behind it is that it's going to reduce your baseline heart rate when you are relaxed. Well, when somebody receives a heart transplant, when the heart is removed from the body, they cut the vagus nerve. So when they put the donor heart in the individual that's receiving it, is their heart rate is actually going to be slightly higher um, than they're used to, because the vagus nerve is not there to promote parasympathetic activity. So the resting heart rate will always be a little bit higher. All right, well, so far we covered quite a bit of the outline. Sorry for the mistakes. It teaches me that I should always read things carefully before I actually start them. And it's also a lesson to all of you to learn from my mistakes. Make sure that you read all the activity instructions so you can get full points. See how I turn my mistake as a lesson for you guys. All right, well, I'll see you next time for one of my favorite parts is systematic pathways. See you in a bit. All right, everyone, well, welcome back. We are now back to my comfort zone, the Zoom whiteboard. And we're going to start talking about systematic pathways. And we're going to talk about that there are quite a few systematic pathways that we're going to talk about. Actually, there's 4. And it pretty much is going to show is how the signal for both the autonomic and somatic systems is transferred from the brain to the actual target tissue. And the first one we're going to talk about is arguably the most straightforward, and that is the somatic system. So everything is going to start from the spinal cord. So this is the somatic. And first we're going to start with the spinal cord. This is a very bad spinal column, but I think you get the idea behind it. And as far as the spinal column goes, it's going to we're just going to say it's dispersed depending on the skeletal muscle tissue that needs to be innervated with a signal. It's going to jut from different parts of the spine. So the neuron is going to be one motor neuron. It's not going to have what's called a ganglia, and I'll explain what a ganglia is in a bit. Where it's going to have one long motor neuron with its terminal axons. So we're just going to say motor neuron. Now it's going to synapse at the intramuscular junction, neuromuscular junction, apologies. And so this is going to be the target, which is going to be skeletal muscle. And the ligand receptor complex, and I'm going to write ligands just to kind of give us an idea. We're going to do ligands in sky blue. And the ligand is going to be acetylcholine, always. And the receptor, I'll put this here in dark green, the receptor is going to be nicotinic. So in the somatic system, at the site of the target tissue in the neuromuscular junction, the ligand is always acetylcholine, and the receptor is always nicotinic, which is an ionotropic receptor and will cause contraction of the muscle tissue. All right, well, now we're going to jump to the next system, which is going to be, we'll just do parasympathetic. Parasympathetic. Now, before we talk about this, we're going to talk about the concept of a ganglia. Go ahead and write this down here, a ganglia. And a ganglia is a site, and recall that ganglia are formed by satellite cells. It is a structure where one synapse or one neuron synapses on several, possibly up to 30. So it kind of looks like this. If you want a representation, you're going to have one, what we call a pregangliotic neuron, I'm just going to draw the axon and axon terminals. It's going to be in this structure called a ganglia. I'm going to visually kind of map it out here. And in the ganglia, there are going to be several other neurons in the form of parasympathetic, not parasympathetic, in a form of paracrine signaling. So I'm just going to say we have 3 other neurons synapsing here. What's going to happen is that they are going to receive a signal. The ligand is always going to be acetylcholine, and the receptor is always going to be nicotinic. And the reason why is because you want these, what we call postsynaptic or postgangliotic neurons. You want them to continue the signal to other tissues. What you are doing is one neuron is going to synapse on others, and they are going to carry their signals to more specific tissues. So at the ganglia, it's always going to be acetylcholine nicotinic. All right, well, now that we have that out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about the parasympathetic system. And the parasympathetic system is what we call craniosacral, because the parasympathetic nerves, they tend to jut from either the cranial part of the spine or the sacral part of the spine. So it is going to be craniosacral. So like this. Let's do, this is the cranial part, this is the sacral part. Now we have something called, because recall that there are several systems that are under parasympathetic innervation, and we are going to have what is called a long, put this on the bottom, we have what's called a long pregangliotic neuron. So we have a long pregangliotic neuron, meaning it's going to be relatively long in length. And then we are going to have the ganglia. And the site of the ganglia, we always have acetylcholine nicotinic, always, between every ganglion that we're going to talk about here. And we are going to have, at the postganglia, we are going to have short postgangliotic neurons. So we are going to have short postgangliotic neurons. And then at the site of the target tissue, we are going to have some very similar friends. We are going to have ACH as the ligand, but instead of the receptor being nicotinic, receptor is going to be muscarinic. So we have acetylcholine binding with muscarinic receptors to create parasympathetic responses. All right, radicals. So now we're going to go to our 2 types of sympathetic systems. So we're going to write up here, once again, ligand, that's our legend, and receptor. And the first one we're going to talk about is the sympathetic norepi system. Now starting with the spine, this is going to be called thoracic, meaning it juts from more the middle part of the spine. So it's going to have thoracic origins. The pregangliotic neurons are going to be short. That's because with sympathetic innervation, it needs to branch off to several different types of specific systems. So we are going to have short I'll just abbreviate it, pregangliotic neuron. And at the site of the ganglia, as I said, we're always going to have ACH and nicotinic. And then we're going to have the postgangliotic neuron that is long. We're going to have long postgangliotic neurons because they need to branch off to several different systems. Not the most pretty postgangliotic neuron in the world, but it has character. Sometimes that's all that matters. Long postgangliotic neurons. And at the site of the target tissue, we are going to have target. We are going to have norepi, norepinephrine, and the receptor is going to be, as we talked about, adrenergic receptors. So this is the norepinephrine system. Norepinephrine is a neuromodulator. All right, radical. Meanwhile, its close relative, the sympathetic, probably easiest if I just erase this. Its close relative is the sympathetic epinephrine system, which is what we're going to talk about. And it has quite a few differences, as we will discover in just a moment. So now we have the sympathetic epinephrine system. Mm-hmm. So it is going to originate from the spine, I believe in the thoracic area, but it doesn't really matter. I'll just put down thoracic, just so we have something to go off of. And it doesn't really have a long or short pregangliotic neuron. It just has what I'll just call pregangliotic neuron. It doesn't really matter, and you'll see why. You're going to have a pregangliotic neuron. And what's interesting here is that it's going to synapse. Now recall that we always have ACH nicotinic, even in this unusual example. And it's unusual because the postgangliotic neuron is not a neuron, it's a modified neuron called a chromaffin cell. And the chromaffin cell is found in the adrenals. So I'm going to draw here on the bottom, I'm going to draw here the adrenals. So this is the kidney. On top of the kidney are the adrenals. And the adrenals in the medulla is there are some cells called chromaffin cells in the medullary portion of it. And what these cells are is they are modified neurons. So this is called a chromaffin cell. It is a modified neuron, chromaffin cells. So the pregangliotic neuron is going to release acetylcholine nicotinic. It's going to bind with nicotinic receptors to stimulate the chromaffin cells. Now the target is going to be the blood. And the ligand that is going to be released is epinephrine. And eventually it's going to bind with adrenergic receptors. So we see this is quite different than the norepinephrine pathway, mainly because the pregangliotic neuron is going to synapse at modified cells, modified neurons called chromaffin cells. At this junction, acetylcholine will bind with nicotinic receptors on the chromaffin cells, and chromaffin cells are going to secrete epinephrine into the blood, and eventually the epinephrine is going to bind with adrenergic receptors. All right, well, now we talked about all the systematic pathways. I hope you found that interesting. Let me make sure that Oh, I put on the study guide the neuroeffector junction. Now, when the neuromodulators are released at the target tissue site, it isn't going to be from one neuron to another or from one neuron to a cell. Instead, it's going to be released through modified neurons called varicosities. And I'm not going to go into too much detail because we're going to go through this next. But the neuroeffector junction here, we see a wide span of tissue. It's going to have several receptors on it. And the neuromodulator or neurotransmitter is going to be released in over a large surface area. So it is not a junction between two neurons. It is going to be a modified neuron releasing large amounts of neurotransmitter over target tissue. And we're going to talk about that next. All right, so I will see you guys shortly. Well, everybody, you are welcome back to the tail end of our Chapter 11 discussion. Now we're going to talk about the different adrenergic receptors, where their targets are in the body, and their actions. And you can refer to the table on the very last page of the outline. And the first thing we're going to talk about, or the first receptor we're going to talk about, and keep in mind, these are all under the category of what we call an adrenergic receptor class. They all bind to epinephrine and norepinephrine. Different receptors have a slightly different affinity for one over the other, but both epinephrine and norepinephrine are very chemically similar, and they can bind to all different types of the adrenergic receptors. Now, the first one we're going to talk about is beta 1. And beta 1 receptors are found mainly on the heart. So they're mainly found on cardiac muscle. The effect is, or the action is going to be to increase cardiac outputs. And this is mainly caused when norepinephrine is released from the neuroeffector junction, binds to adrenergic receptors, beta 1 receptors on the cardiac tissue, then it's going to stimulate an increase of cardiac output. What's interesting about this is that there's a number of agonists and antagonists. And the agonist we're going to talk about is called a beta blocker. Actually, this is the antagonist, apologies. So what this does is it is going to prevent norepinephrine from binding with the beta 1 receptors. Now, this is an antagonist, excuse me as I erase this. This is an antagonist that is specific to beta 1 receptors, meaning that it is not going to bind with any other type of adrenergic receptor. This is good because it gives it specificity as far as its effect goes. And what a beta blocker does is it is going to prevent the increase in cardiac output. So what happens is that somebody becomes nervous, and if they take a beta blocker, their heart rate is going to slow down. Why does this work? A couple reasons. So one is that for some people, the feeling of their heart pumping and beating raises anxiety. So it can be used for people that suffer from anxiety, but it can also be used by people who have chronic hypertension too. An agonist and I don't really know why you would even. I'm sure there are some therapeutic situations where this would be necessary, but one agonist is going to be dopamine. Recall that dopamine in the system and in the brain have different effects. And in the system, it actually is a beta 1 agonist and can increase cardiac output. All right, the next one we're going to talk about is a beta 2 receptor. Now we're going to talk about a beta 2 receptor. And the target for this is going to be 2. It's going to be the bronchioles. And it's also going to be found on the arterioles of skeletal muscle. Now, what are the actions? Well, the actions are as follows. The actions are going to be vasodilation of muscle. What this means is that it is going to increase blood flow to the muscles, providing them with more nutrients, and thus they can exert more power, more strength, and more endurance. You can notice this too when you do what's called warming up, unless you're not very wise like me and you just jump straight into lifting without any regard for this being called warming up. All right, great. So it's also going to cause bronchodilation. So what this is going to do is it is going to open up, it's going to increase the radius of your bronchial tubes. And some people have asked me, why aren't your bronchioles always dilated? Why don't you want maximum airflow at all time? And the answer is that, well, the wider your bronchioles are, the greater chance that an environmental pollutant or a pathogen can get into your lower respiratory tract. Obviously, that's not something that's very preferred. So the agonist we'll talk about is going to be albuterol. And some of you who have asthma probably have an albuterol inhaler. So what this does, actually, no, what am I doing? Yes, sorry, I am right. It is indeed an agonist. I thought I made this mistake again. So what happens is that your body, under certain situations, thinks that it is actually protecting the body by causing bronchoconstriction. It really thinks that there's something that you've inhaled that is going to cause you grave danger. So it thinks it's protecting you by constricting the bronchioles and restricting airflow. Well, when someone has symptoms of this, a couple puffs of the inhaler will introduce albuterol into the respiratory tract. And this is specific for the beta 2 receptor, which means that it will not bind to any other adrenergic receptor besides the beta 2 receptors. If that were not the case, then, well, you'd be very ready to go every time you took your inhaler. So this is supposed to give you the effects of bronchodilation without the other effects of the sympathetic response. Something to note too is that albuterol will not work if the airways are 100% constricted. So it works very, very well though if you're in the early stages of it. We don't talk about an antagonist because there really is no logical reason to have a beta 2 antagonist outside of a laboratory setting. You can imagine why that would not be preferred. I'm not going to write down too much about the beta 3 receptor. mainly because it's only found on one type of tissue, and that is brown fats. Found on brown fats. We're not really sure why they're there. I think I've read a couple of research studies that have found somewhat of a purpose for them, but I don't think there's anything concrete on it yet. But it's found on brown fat, uh, I guess, brown adipose tissue. Next is going to be what we call an alpha-1 receptor. And alpha-1 receptors are found on vascular smooth muscle. So alpha-1. And these are found on smooth muscle. Vascular tissue, apologies. So vascular smooth muscle. So vascular are your arterioles. And one thing we haven't talked about yet is that arterioles, like we've been talking about with the other beta receptors, they actually have a layer of smooth muscle. This can increase or decrease the radius or diameter of the blood vessel. So it is found on vascular smooth muscle. It's also found on gastrointestinal and urinary sphincters, as well as the iris and the erector pili. Now let's talk about the effects. So it's going to trigger vasoconstriction of the vascular smooth muscle and the sphincters. So what this does is that it is going to restrict blood flow from going into many of your body systems, such as the digestive tract, the urinary tract, the integument system. So by constricting them, you increase resistance of blood flow. Because of that, they're going to go to the area of least restriction. And we know that thanks to beta-2 receptors, that is going to be in the more dilated skeletal muscle arterioles. So in short, you are going to reroute blood from many of your body systems to your heart and skeletal muscle. Now we have a couple of antagonists here. One is going to be terazosin. That is going to be the antagonist. Terazosin. Actually, indicated as a therapeutic medicine for an enlarged prostate. It's also used to combat hypertension. Another one is going to be phenylephrine. Don't think I spelled that right. And this has a couple of indications. Apologies, it is an agonist. So this is actually used as you probably have seen it in several types of cough medicines. And also it can be used to increase systematic blood pressure. We'll talk about why that works when we get to the chapter on blood flow. All right, the last one is going to be alpha-1 receptors. Sorry, alpha-2. And alpha-2 are involved in negative feedback of norepinephrine release from the neuroeffector junction. So these are alpha-2 receptors. And it's also found on the presynaptic neuron as well. There's both neurons and varicosities secretes norepinephrine. So the target is going to be the same thing that releases it, which is going to be the presynaptic neuron. And the target is going to be, sorry, the action is going to be negative feedback. So what happens here is that norepinephrine is going to act as an autocrine signal. So as norepinephrine is released, the question is what stops it from being released? And the answer is that, I'm going to draw a quick diagram here. So we have the presynaptic neuron, we have norepinephrine receptor, and we have norepinephrine. When norepinephrine is released into the synapse, some of it is going to come back and bind with receptors on the presynaptic neuron, and that is going to inhibit further norepinephrine release. We're going to talk about some agonists. One agonist is called clonidine. I think I spelled that wrong. Yes, I did. Clonidine. And what this is going to do is it is going to be a means to decrease hypertension. That's one of its indications. The other is an antidepressant that goes by the term Remeron. And what this does is it is an antagonist. Let me add here is an agonist. So what this does is it is going to increase the time that norepinephrine is in the synapse, leading to increased alertness, increased activity, increased cognition. So it's just one of the medications indicated to help restore energy in depressive people. All right. Now I know that students have asked me in the past. They said, "Well, I take Remeron and I get very sleepy." That's because only one of its functions is going to be as an alpha-2 antagonist. It does affect other receptors as well. All right, and the last one is going to be muscarinic. And muscarinic receptors here. So we know that acetylcholine is going to bind with muscarinic receptors. As far as the heart goes, it is going to decrease cardiac output in times of rest. And as far as the bronchioles go, it is going to increase bronchoconstriction. As I said, this is rather misleading. It doesn't purposely make them more narrow. It just returns it back to baseline. And I put a question on the bottom here. I think it's something for you to really think about, is why is targeting each type of adrenergic receptor specifically more preferred than just straight injecting epinephrine into somebody's body, like with an EpiPen? Think about it. I think you can come up with a pretty good justification for it. All right, great. Well, this is the end of our chapter 11. Hope you all enjoyed learning about it.